Many Seiko collectors are familiar with the Seiko 6139 that Colonel William Pogue took into space. That was a pretty groundbreaking revelation back in, I believe, the late 2000s amongst collectors. Just recently I learned that there's actually evidence that an even more vintage Seiko has been up in space. And that is sort of strange and surprisingly the Seiko 6159 7001. That was their first professional 300-meter dive watch. And the story behind it is a little strange. It's the sources for it aren't many, but there's enough information to basically solidify this as an actual event that occurred. I first stumbled upon it when I was searching on the old Seiko Citizen Watch forum. There was a post referencing this back in 2002. There was a post referencing this in 2014 on the newer Seiko Citizen Watch forum. And Anthony Cable has an article on this that he posted a few months ago on his wonderful plus9time.com website. Now, in all three instances, they basically use the same source, which is a Japanese watch magazine from the 90s that happened to have some pictures and some descriptive text on the matter. As it turns out, after I learned about it, I discovered that I had yet another piece of reference material that's important for the story. That's sort of the background out of the way, and my references will be below in the text. But basically, oh yes, and there's another element. The owner of the 6159 is actually a pretty well-known guy. Not that interested in anime and manga, so I didn't really know who he was, but I imagine a lot of others will. And the owner of the 6159 is an artist by the name of Leiji Matsumoto, and he's a famous anime manga artist who was involved in cartoons like anime or whatever it would be, Space Pirate Captain Harlock and Space Battleship Yamato. These were animated series that were shown in Japan, but apparently at this stage they have a worldwide audience, and he's pretty well loved around the world and is considered a pretty significant figure in Japan. And as I learned, oddly enough, not in the sources I had mentioned already, but in the 2008 World Mook Diver's Watch, which is, I think, still accessible big book of basically pictures of lots of vintage watches. As it turns out, there was also an interview with Matsumoto in the book. And the weird thing about the interview is it mostly talks about how he got into collecting sports watches back in the 70s, how he couldn't afford things and he was saving things up, and he'd go to Ginza and he'd look at the different models that were available. And it mostly focuses on a 1,000-meter Orient watch that he really wanted, but he missed out on, and then he ended up getting it cheap. And if you look at the pictures, as you see here, he was really into that watch, and he has lots of different versions of it, even like photographs of it. But buried in the story is his 6159 that, oh yeah, by the way, that went in space. And basically the story is, when he was about 33 years old, his wife gifted him this watch, and he loved it. He traveled around the world with it. He always claimed it was super durable. Apparently it was never serviced, and even though it's a high beat watch, which is really a bit sketchy, but regardless, he claimed it was always super durable, reliable, and when he would travel around the world, he was always proud that others would recognize the value of the Seiko brand. And I imagine he also had an interest in space, given that some of the number of the animated series that he was involved in took place in space. And that's the history of the owner, his background, and how he got the watch. In the 90s, a Japanese engineer by the name of Mamoru Mori had a chance to, and was ultimately qualified for, to go up into space in 1992 on the NASA Space Shuttle Endeavour. And somehow Matsumoto got in touch with Mori and had asked if his 6159 could be taken up into space. And the information on this part isn't the most reliable, but apparently Mori contacted NASA and he got approval to take the watch up into space. And it was taken up into space. Now, Anthony Cable on his Plus9Time website has some photos of Mori on the Endeavour, and he's wearing two different watches, but neither of them are the 6159. And when he got back down to Earth, NASA provided documentation, a letter stating that yes, this watch has been up in space and traveled X amount of miles, and this is all true, which apparently meant the world to Matsumoto, who continued wearing his watch. And the fact that he continued wearing his watch, and as you see in the picture here, still has it and wears it, is proof that the 6159 was able to survive spaceflight, and he still has it. Incidentally, he also ended up having an Omega Speedmaster commemorative made for one of his other animated series after, I think Galaxy 999 or something to that effect. So basically, it was just one of his many interesting watches, and that's sort of the story behind it. Apparently, it was stowed on the shuttle. In the translation from the 2008 World Mook, it appears that he says Mori wore it, but I'm not sure if that translation is accurate because I use Google Translate. But that's basically the story, and if anyone else can access the 1990s Japanese magazine, which I'll post the name of below as well, and they could get a enlarged picture of the NASA letter and things like that, that would really, I think, be helpful to sort of solidify everything. And that's basically the story of how the Seiko 6159 ended up going to space and the documentation behind it. And I just want to finish this whole story by saying how amusing it is to me that Seiko must have known that their watches had been into space. In the case of the 6139, or especially in the case of the 6159, where this happened in the 90s, and all the figures involved were nationally known at the time. So it sort of makes you wonder if Seiko really did know about all of this and simply didn't care, which is really funny because when you think of the Omega Speedmaster, when the Speedmaster was produced, it wasn't produced for space travel. It was a fluke that it got picked for space travel, and since then, that became its entire meaning for existence, the Moonwatch. Whereas there's evidence of the 6139 being in space, the 6159 being in space, and to my knowledge, Seiko never even did anything with it marketing-wise, which I really think is sort of cool, because if nothing, it certainly indicates they're confident in their watch's abilities that they're built for, that they don't need to go so far. Because this is hardly the only Seiko sports watch from the 70s that's been through lots of grueling adventures. But that's basically it with this story, and if anyone else can add anything to it, I'd certainly be grateful. And once again, I strongly advise you to check out Anthony Cable's plus9time.com article and website, which really has a lot of detail on vintage Seikos and even new Seikos. And that's about it for this video, and as usual, thanks for watching.